Hello fellow computer enthusiasts, my name is Christian, hope you're doing well today. Welcome to the new episode of ILTPWC, where we continue to create a video game from scratch to Steam. You might remember that we are currently in the exploration phase of our game development process, where we build an evolutionary prototype to see if our game idea really shines and if it makes fun to play. It also provides valuable feedback about assets that we need to build or to buy, and to evaluate if our game development skill set matches our expectations. In the last episode, we developed a basic character controller for our tower defense RPG mashup crossover game that allowed the enemy characters to run along waypoints and give our player characters, which acts as some sort of towers, the ability to attack the lanes. In today's episode, we will add a game controller to spawn enemies and to add the first win and lose conditions so that we can actually play through our prototype. But as always, before we discuss the details, let's first discuss what we want to achieve today before we go into Visual Studio and translate our dreams into working code. We need some kind of a game manager that is able to identify, based on certain conditions, if a player is allowed to act, if the enemy is in charge of attacking, or if a faction has already lost or won the current combat situation. In order to write the code efficient, let's define that the conditions will be checked on certain events, like a player character's death, so that we don't have to check them in every frame of physics update. The only thing we need to make sure is that we cover all circumstances to raise the necessary events. Okay, let's get into our project and start with the first class for today, which we will call the GameController. We will also assign it to the Unity object that we have previously created called GameController, and then we will jump right into Visual Studio and add our source code. As always, I will start with the header information, so adding some namespaces, and also the consider to like and subscribe description, because that really helps out my channel. Okay, and the first thing that we need to do is we need to add a public enum called gameState so that we can differentiate between the different states of the game. The first state is called player state, that's when the player is allowed to act. Then we have the enemy state, where the enemy is allowed to act, and then we will also have the certain win and lose conditions, and we call them win and lose. The next thing that we need is a property for this enum. We will start with the private variable from type gameState, call it gameState with lowercase, and we will then add the property because I would like to override the setter. So in this case, public gameState, gameState, and then we will use the standard getter. So we just return our gameState. And for the setter, I would like to differentiate for the different phases. So first we set the game state to value. That is the value passed to the property. And then we will switch game state. And in case that game state is player, then we would like to invoke a Unity event so that other game objects have the ability to react on this certain event. And we will do the same for all the other events that we have. So in case that game state is enemy, we would also like to do something. And the same goes for the win and the lose condition. Next thing that we then obviously need are these events, because they're currently not there. And we will create them after finishing this switch statement. Okay. Now we have the template, and now let's create our Unity events that we need. So it's Unity event on enter player state, as well as on enter enemy state, on enter win state, and last but not least on enter lose state. Okay, and now we can just invoke these so that other game objects have the ability to react on them. Okay, In case you just don't know, I will shortly show you how these Unity events look like in the Unity editor. So now on our game object with the game controller, you see all the different Unity events that we have created. And the good thing is you can now just add different scripts and call functions on these script. And you can also pass parameters. And that's very helpful if you would like to have other game objects react on certain events on another game object. Just keep that in mind. So the next thing we need to do is to add our user interface controller, because the game controller usually acts at some point of a reference point within our project. So every object referencing the game controller has also access to all the other shared components like the user interface, the camera, and the spawn logic, and so on. Okay, in order to reference these, we need to create them first, and we will later add the source code to these. The first thing is called the UI combat controller, because we will also have a UI controller for the village scene and so on. So for all the different game states that we have discussed in our concept. Okay, let's get into the source code again for our game controller and add the reference. So in this case, it's a public UI combat controller, and we call it the UI controller. Okay, the next thing that we need to take care of is the UI controller is not allowed to be null. So on start of our game, we check if the UI controller is null. And if this is the case, we raise an exception so that we have a missing reference exception here. And we tell the developer, okay, you must assign the UI combat controller. You can also select the combat controller by name and look for all these assets in the scene, but I like to do this in a manual way, just to make sure that all the scenes are properly set up and everything is working as I would like to have it. Okay, and then we will also set the game state that we have previously created to the player state. And we use the property here so that the onEnterPlayerState event can also become invoked. So the next thing that we need to do is to add a little bit of game logic, but please keep in mind that we only do this in our exploration phase for the prototype, because usually I would separate this code into other classes. But for convenience reasons, we will do it here in the game controller in order to finish our exploration phase and this prototype very fast. So first thing that we need is we need a list of all characters that are currently alive in our game, so that we can evaluate the certain win and lose conditions and check whether the player won the combat situation or not. Okay, so we will create a list, call it characters alive. And this is just a new list. And with the new Visual Studio version, I mean C# version, you can now just write new parentheses, and then you will create a new list of type character. Okay, the next thing that we need are game objects for the UI elements that we need, because we will also handle the callbacks from the user interface in order to spawn our player characters. That is something that I wouldn't do in a production-ready game, but for now, for the sake of this prototype, it's fine for me. Okay, so we need two variables that we can assign in the Unity editor. I call them UI element player unit selector. And we will also need a game object called UI element and round. These are the buttons that we use. Okay, the next thing is that we also need a list of all the tiles that the player can click on to spawn different units, because currently the player is only allowed to do that on certain tiles. And we have to see and to find out if this is something that's pretty good or not. And for that, we will have to create a list with all the tiles. And we also need to create the class for the tiles. So let's do that first. So we create a new class and we call them, it's a tile where a player can spawn, so tile spawn, a player spawn. Okay. So next thing we need to do is we need to provide some callbacks for the user interface in order to act when the player clicks on the end round button and also when the player clicks on the spawn player character button. So for this we will create public methods called on UI button and round, and we will add logic here. And later we will also need a public void on spawn player character click. And we also will add logic later. Okay, that's it for now for the GameController class. Let's switch back to Unity and create all the necessary UI elements that we need. So we first need a button for to end the round that you have seen in our working code example. And then we also need to add the tiles. Okay, before I build the user interface in Unity, let's have a short break for a quick announcement. I know it's pretty hard to follow long video tutorials on YouTube, and I also understand that it might be annoying to copy and paste source code from a video. So I have good news for you guys. I will in future upload all sources shown in my videos and also the previous ones to the ILTPWC GitHub repositories. So make sure to like and subscribe and also to leave a star on GitHub. It might take some days before you find the new tutorials from an uploaded video in the repository, because I have to replace all the board assets where I don't have a license to redistribute with Unity primitives, therefore that you can download the tutorial files and execute it on your machine. So in order to create our user interface, we need some resources that I have created previously. We have some screenshots from the different hero types that we currently have. One is the melee one and the other one is the woman, which is currently our range character. I have also bought and created a basic button layout for our user interface and also the shape for the player selectors bar or character selectors bar. Okay, and the first thing that we need to do is to create a canvas. On that canvas, I have different panels. The top left one is the one showing ILTPWC exploration phase demo. And then we have the bottom center with scrolling rect that we can use to scroll through all the buttons. I will show it in the game itself. So when we click on something, we have the scroll button here. So we can add as many unit types that we want, and then we can just scroll through them. Okay. In general, scrolling rect works in Unity like you have a viewport with all the content, and then you can also add different scroll bars, vertical, horizontal, and so on. We should hide them. There's also the option to auto hide them on start, which is very helpful in our case. Okay, the next thing is for the content, we will add different buttons. Later we will do this in a programmatical way, but for now I have just added these by hand to have just an example for our prototype. Okay, and we will also have the end round button in the bottom right of the screen. And when you click these, then we tell the game controller, okay, now the player phase comes to an end and the enemy is now to act. Okay, and we also need to connect these buttons on the different with different callbacks. So for example, we take the end round button and there's an on click listener, and then we can just collect our game controller, put it there, and use the function from the game controller called on UI button and round. Okay, that's basically how it works. If you want, you can just copy the source code from GitHub. Source code will be available in a few days or weeks. and I will recreate it with plain non-licensed images and 3D assets, and then you can just copy and paste how it works. Then let's get back to the code. Okay guys, now that we have our user interface, we need to come back to the logic to spawn some of the player characters. In order to do that, let's define two variables from type GameObject in order to store our prefabs for the melee and also for the range character. So let's call it melee prefab as well as GameObject, public GameObject, range prefab. Okay, and then we will fill the method on spawn player character click. And what we do there is we need two variables that we will assign. One is called spawn, which is just new at this point in time. And another one for the game object itself, where we store the new spawn character or object. And it's also a new one, so just initialized. Okay, then let's differentiate between the UI controller dot tile that triggered hero selection and there's the spawn type. Okay, and in case that the tile spawn type is melee, then we would like to spawn a melee character, and if it's a range character, so tile spawn type is range, we would like to spawn a range character. Usually we should do this in a different method where one of the parameters is the spawn type, but for the prototype now we will just do it in this switch case and we'll just spawn the character. Okay, in order to do that we need the location where to spawn the character, and this is a new vector 3 where we take from our UI controller dot tile that triggers the hero selection, the game object of this tile, the transform, and the position. And we need the X value as well as the Z value to know where to place our character. The height value, so the Y value, is fixed, and this is at this point in time 1.69, but later we will check where to spawn this character. But for now, let's go with a fixed value and we factor this later. Okay, and we also take the Z coordinate from the tile that triggered the hero selection, the game object, and also the transform there, position Z coordinate. Okay, now we have in spawn the position to spawn the object. Now we can initialize, and you do that with instantiate the melee prefab. So that is telling, okay, what to spawn. Then on the spawn location, that explains where to spawn. And also we need to define the rotation of the object. And in this case, it's a quaternion identity, which essentially means no rotation for the object. Okay, we also do some tricks with the UI elements and tell them, okay, now you can hide the player unit selector and set active to false. And we will also tell the tile that triggered the menu to spawn the character that it has now a hero, to prevent showing us the same dialog of spawning a hero again. Okay, and then we will just copy and paste the source code. I know it's a very bad taste to do it. We should do it in the method, and we do it later when we refactor the source code. And the only thing that we change here is in order to spawn a prefab for the range character. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is we need to manage these objects in the list of the characters that are alive, so that at a later point in time we can check our win and lose conditions, and we will also assign this game controller as a reference point to these characters. So object.get components, they're the character that we have finished in our last video, and they're the game controller. Okay, it's not an object now, but I will add this later. Is this? And also the character alive list. So character alive dot add the object, get component, character. Okay. Okay, now we are good to go with this part. Next thing that we need to do is to define what should happen when we press the on UI button end round. And then we have to tell the controller, okay, now the enemy is allowed to act. So this is very simple with our property. It's just game state is now game state.enemy. And we also have to hide all the UI elements. So the button for the end round should set active pin false. And for each player tile, we should also hide them so that the player is not allowed to spawn new player characters while the enemy is acting. Later we will do this a little bit cleaner, but for now, just to test if our prototype is working and more important, if it makes fun to play or not, we do it here in a simple way. Okay, and now we are good to go and can see if it works. I missed one thing. We need to add the GameController reference to our character class. So public GameController, GameController. Okay, and now everything should be good to go. Okay, so we have passed the 20-minute mark of this video, and I think we covered everything that we planned for the GameController so far. I'm currently figuring out how to provide this kind of videos to you, because you might have noticed that my game is always ahead of the videos due to the fact that I'm used to do the recording after the programming and testing session, because I want to provide already refactored code. Coding for me is not just a one-shot, it's more like 3 steps forward and 1 step back, and so I'm improving source code quality over time. So please let me know in the comment if you like this step-by-step approach for this kind of videos, or if you would like to have a summary or more explanation-like video for working code. With this approach we could also cover more content in a 20-minute video. The next video of this series will cover the spawning mechanism for the enemies, as well as filling the win and lose condition events with live. So, as always, thanks a lot for watching this episode of ILTPWC. If you like what I'm doing, please consider to like and subscribe, because that really helps out the channel with the YouTube algorithm. Oh, and one special announcement, my pregnant wife is in labor and I will be a father in the next few hours or days. So the next video update might take a little bit longer. My plan is to come up with a bi-weekly release cycle of videos beginning of 2023. When I have learned all the bits of pieces necessary to do this video content creation.